Well, this week's gospel begins with Jesus trying to get away. He has just heard that John the Baptist has been murdered, and Jesus withdraws by boat to a deserted place alone, perhaps to grieve or perhaps simply to absorb the news that his cousin has just been beheaded. Notice here that even Jesus needed room to process bad news. And it's a reminder to us that even the Son of God is careful with himself. But the crowds hear where he's headed, and they go by foot around the shore and beat him there. So Jesus, stepping off the boat, expecting to find solitude, only finds that the place is already full of people who need him. The writer of Matthew tells us that he has compassion on them and heals their sick, even in the midst of his own grief. But by evening, the disciples come to him with a perfectly reasonable logistical question. They ask him, or they say, "This is a deserted place and the hour is late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." This isn't a bad plan. It's the kind of solution that any of us would suggest. But Jesus then turns to them and says something that may have landed very strangely when he says, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." Of course, the disciples do the math out loud because the math is not in their favor. We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. 5,000 men, Matthew says, besides the women and children. 5 loaves, 2 fish. This is the kind of math problem that is a bit of a joke. And Jesus takes exactly that. He takes these loaves and these fish, nothing more, and he looks up to heaven, he blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to the disciples to give to the crowd. Everyone is fed, and everyone is satisfied. And after the meal, they gather 12 baskets of leftovers from a meal that started with next to nothing. My friends, listen again to the verbs in this story. Jesus took the loaves, blessed them, broke them, and gave them to the disciples. Taken, blessed, broken, given. If that shape sounds familiar to you, it should. You hear something like this at the altar nearly every Sunday. Our Eucharistic prayers echoes the story of the night before Jesus died, where he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and then gave it to his disciples. The church has learned to recognize in this pattern not only what happens to bread, but something about how God works through human lives, where we are gathered, blessed, broken, and sent. What we have received is then transformed into a gift. But I want to be careful here, because broken does not mean that suffering is required before we can be useful to God. God does not need us to be exhausted, traumatized, or wounded. The things that break us are not qualifications, though God can meet us and work through us even in them. Some of you have been broken by real things. Hard years, real loss, illness, disappointment, a long season of not knowing who would stand here next. God does not call those things good, but neither are they beyond God's redeeming reach. And Jesus does not ask his disciples to somehow manufacture abundance. He asks them simply to offer what they have. They provide the bread and the fish, but they themselves do not create the miracle. Their work is real, but it is not the entirety of their work. Jesus saying, "You give them something to eat," was an invitation to participate in what God is already doing and to help accomplish what only God can. that distinction matters, especially for people who are already carrying too much. The Reverend Lizzie McManus Dale wrote in her newsletter this week that the church can be tempted to labor for the many in number but empty in value promises of the powers and principalities that persuade us that the harvest is scarce. This is a striking way to put it, where we can spend enormous energy trying to prove that we are successful by the standards of the world, that we are larger, busier, more visible, or more impressive, and still lose sight of the life God has already placed in our hands. When we look at 5 loaves and a few fish and say, what could we possibly do with that? He goes on to remind us to not only ask what we can do with what we have, but what God might do with it through us and with us. She ended her newsletter with a gut punch for me by reminding me that the harvest is plentiful, always. But for most congregations, the powers that preach scarcity are a little more mundane. Those things can be an attendance chart, a comparison to bigger churches down the road, a budget line item that keeps your vestry, and especially your new rector, up at night. A fear that if we are not growing in the right way, we must not matter. My friends, those pressures are real. Budgets and attendance do matter. The future of this congregation matters. But those things become powers when they begin to dictate to us who we are, or when they persuade to us that our worth is measured by size, efficiency, visibility, or institutional success. 3 weeks into knowing St. Paul's, I am beginning to see, and I hope you will all help me continue to see more clearly, that abundance is already among us. I want to say something very declarative to you this morning. St. Paul's abundance sitting in this room right now might have been neglected. Not because anyone here has failed. Scarcity does not need failure to take root. It just simply needs a few hard years, a pandemic, or a long in-between season of transition. The scarcity mindset plants itself quietly, and pretty soon a whole congregation starts believing its own version of, we only have 5 loaves and fish. I, too, have noticed that reflex in myself already more than once in the last couple of weeks. The instinct to list what we do not have before naming what we do, that we're too small or too tired. But here is the thing that I am truly seeing. People come to St. Paul's and ultimately stay at St. Paul's because of its people. You all show up for each other in ways that never make it onto a website or a pledge card, through meals brought over without being asked, to the ride offered to someone who cannot drive, to the name remembered at coffee hour, the patience extended to a newcomer still learning where the bathrooms are. These small acts are no small thing. It is the actual abundance of this parish that is more vibrant, more alive, and richer in ways that matter than we have sometimes allowed ourselves to believe. Jesus says something similar to this earlier in the same gospel when he's speaking on the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives a light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." You, beloved, are the light of the world. Your life is meant to make God's light visible. Perhaps it's through humility, caution, or habit. St. Paul's has sometimes kept that light under a basket. Whatever the reason, I don't want us doing that anymore. Because we are going to stop neglecting the abundance that is already here. This is not a promise I can make good on from the pulpit by myself. It is a decision I am asking us to make together starting today. When that reflex comes that tells us that we are too small or too tired or too far behind to matter, I want you to catch it and reorient it. We are going to name it for what it is, and we are going to refuse to let scarcity have the last word. Not because 5 loaves are secretly enough on their own, because they're not. But because the disciples were never asked to make 5 loaves into enough. They were simply asked to place what they had in Jesus' hands and participate in what Jesus was already doing. This week, I want to ask you to notice one place where you have been quietly underselling what is actually happening here. In a conversation you have with a neighbor, maybe the conversation you have in your head, or in the way you talk about this congregation in larger community circles. Tell the true vision instead. Tell someone about the person who called you when you were sick, or about the community that carried you through a hard season. Tell the story of the people who show up quietly and faithfully when showing up matters. Let that light out from under the basket on purpose and watch what God does with it. Because the fourfold shape from the hillside, where 5 loaves and 2 fishes are taken, blessed, broken, and given, is not only what happens to them, it is not only what happens to the bread and wine at this altar, it is a pattern and symbol of grace. St. Paul's, you are gathered here and we are blessed. Some of us have been wounded by real things, not because the wounds were necessary, but because God's love reaches us even there. Because that is what happened to the bread on the hillside. It was taken, blessed, broken, and given. And that is what happens at this rail every week. Ordinary things are received, blessed, and made into gifts beyond what they could have been on their own. The abundance does not erase the hard things behind it. It does not erase the grief, the weariness, or the real limits of what the disciples have. It just simply refuses to let scarcity have the final word. So bring your 5 loaves. Bring the people you already love into this room and the ways you already show up for each other. Because my promise to you is that I will bring mine too. Because 3 weeks of getting to know you has given me a growing conviction that God is not wanting for us to become something we are not. God is already in what St. Paul's already is. So let us stop hiding that light under a basket. Let us offer to God what we have, and let us together see what God does when we put it out to the open. Amen.